Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Professor Hamamoto on February 2nd, 2021. It's 3 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, and I welcome you to another exciting investigation. And before you tune out, I would just have to tell you, you haven't really heard the real story, the full story of vampires. I'm still learning a lot too. And I tell you this because I just realized that in my many years of being an educator, I realized the problem wasn't that students didn't know, right? That they were lacking information. After all, that's what I was there for, is to provide it. But I found that the most significant obstacle in teaching was dealing with individual students or anybody really who think they know what you're about to tell them, right? They think they have a grasp on it, and they're too quick to understand what is about to be laid out. So suspend judgment for the next 60 minutes and just go with it here. And I'm sure, even with that being said, I'm sure there's a lot of people who are watching this or will watch it who have far more in-depth and nuanced information, understanding, and interpretive appreciation of the vampire phenomenon. I don't dispute that. Just like there are people who are Beatlemaniacs who know what happened to John, Paul, George, and Ringo every single day of their life. And but they have the assumption, the arrogance to think that that's all they need to know, is all the little details, all the factoids, all the little bits of information which they're incapable of putting together in a comprehensive synthetic manner. That is a synthesis of what this means. And that's what I'm here today, is trying to help us understand, myself included. I'm part of this process, to help us, including myself, understand what is going on today in 2021 and all the strange, bizarre, I would argue, occultic and metaphysical transformations that have been taking place over the last year, really, up to including the great conjunction at the end of last year, and through the rituals that we were seeing enacted on Capitol Hill on January 6th. So that is part of the reason why I'm returning to this topic of what I am titling today, Vampiric PSYOPS. Because as we know, it's very strong in the culture, the popular culture in particular, and I'll get into that in a moment. But we shouldn't rest at that level. That's really it's kind of like the limited hangout popular culture, right? It's like we're providing this information so you think you know what it is, and you'll just move on and you won't probe beneath it. You're quick to understand it, and you're going to tune out to the true vampiric behavior and psychology that is being visited upon not just the United States of America, but the entire world, right? I'm being a little bit cryptic here, so let me get into some specifics right away. First of all, I thank you for taking a look. Some of you have taken the initiative and even ordered the book, great, of Professor Nick Groom, that's Groom, Nick Groom of the University of Exeter in Britain. He has a new book called The Vampire: A New History. And again, it's not definitive. None of this scholarship is. It's an ongoing project. Same way with science, it's by definition an ongoing project. Nobody knows comprehensively what it is until the day of judgment, perhaps with a capital J. So we have to keep that modesty in check, so far as our own hubris, our own arrogance about our intelligence, our grasp of what's going on. But that makes it fun, right? I mean, we're trying to work this out together. So Professor Nick Groom has his new book out. Let me just tell you a little bit about him. I came upon his work in a very curious way several years ago. I can't remember exactly when. And I don't have a copy of the book. I think it's in storage. But I was fascinated by these series of tiny little books. They're miniature books in itself, and they have really interesting graphics on the covers and the binding. It's quality paper, and there's a whole series published by the Oxford University Press, which, as many of you know by the name, it was strictly a academic press. But somewhere along the line, the editor said, "Hey, we're sitting on a treasure trove of information, and all these chic and trendy incursions into our field, the humanities and the classics, are pushing us to the background. We need to do something to reach out to the larger public, the general public, to show that this body of information is important, not just for the sake of knowledge itself, but for human survival, for civilizational survival and evolution to the future stages that we will together achieve and realize in the coming years, despite all the efforts of the people who are trying to put us out of business," right? You know who they are. They're trying valiantly. It's not going to work because we're returning, like here, you're here. We're returning to the roots. We're returning to the sources of knowledge, and it's coming from our artists and intellectuals, men and women both, right? It's not coming from children. I know, you put Greta Thunberg all there and all these adolescent types who say, "Yeah, hey, boomer, just move out of the way. We're going to take over. It's the Green New Deal." No. This information here is the product of maturity, not of individuals, but of civilizations, of cultures, of tribes, of states that together forge new ideas out of past experiences and also visions of the new future. That's where it's working. So this is where Nick Groom comes into the picture, Professor Nick Groom. And I say professor because, as I said last time, there is a efflorescence, let's call it, of literature, of scholarly work coming out of the university now in, I think what it is, it's a reaction to about 20, 30, 40 years, maybe, let's say 30 years of academic work that focuses exclusively on race, class, gender, race, class, gender, that's all. That's it. And of course, that comes out of the Marxian tradition. The Marxists, the theoretical Marxists realize they're not going to get anywhere by promoting class conflict. All right. So let's find out the fissures in ethnic groups and in gender and on. Let's work at those, and that way we can create the chaos that will destroy nation states so that we can go in there and buy everything up for pennies on the dollar and make tons of money. Because really, when it gets down to Marxism, socialism, communism, ironically, is a capitalist enterprise, and it's even funded by those people. It's called the dialectic, right? You know this. People are watching this. So the Oxford University Press, I think it's the oldest university press in the world. Any language you pick, it's even older than any university press that comes out of France. The whole medieval Gothic, right, as we'll be getting to in a moment, system of learning. Oxford was there. So they've updated their game, and they brought in Professor Nick Groom to do a small little, it's called A Very Short History of the Gothic. And I bought one. They're cheap. They're like $10. And you could read them, while you're having your coffee and your pastry at the coffee. Well, when cafes were still open, you could do that and read them and have fun. And it's not for a specialist. There's a bibliography in the end if you really want to nerd out on stuff, or if you're an academic specialist in these fields, then you can go and read Professor Groom's larger academic and him and other people, because this is a subspecialty within the field of literature, and it's bigger than ever, ladies and gentlemen. And the beauty is that we already are acquainted with some of its products. We're already there. We're the children of Harry Potter, and even before that of the Inklings, right? J.R.R. Tolkien, and there's a whole history there that embodies these ideas that I'll be speaking to today. So that's how I was interested. Just a little tiny little book. You never know where it's going to lead you. And then I found this recent book about the vampire history. And in the book, and this is in keeping with my earlier statement today, but don't be too quick to understand, or don't be too quick to think you know all about vampires, because that's the same sense that cautionary sense that Professor Groom went into before he wrote the book. He puts it right there. He says, this is not the book that you're looking for that talks about these blood-sucking creatures on the movies or on Netflix. Yeah, that's a manifestation of it, but his job is to talk more specifically about the historical and political and the economic roots of the Gothic imagination out of which the vampire figure arose. And it's not as boring as it might seem. It's very exciting because you know what? We're living it out here in 2021, and we're going to prevail over the evildoers in Davos, who also were influenced by this strain of thought. It's more than a strain; it's a school of thought. It's a movement. The Gothic imagination was a political, economic, colonizing movement. And the people that you see in these think tanks, the generals in NATO, whether they're aware of it or not, come out of the Gothic tradition. And so do we. We're steeped in it to the point that we're oblivious to it, like a fish swimming in its own water, in its own fetid tank. We're a captive, but we don't even realize it, right? So let's plunge in here. Most of you know that all you have to do is look in the Netflix, and I just checked it out today. You have tons of movies, even by their mid-70s. People were saying, man, there's just too many movies and too much literature on the vampire to even bother attempting to create a filmography or bibliography. But let me just tell you some of the curious iterations of the vampire figure, unless you are already acquainted with it, and some of you are. Of course, there's the classic 1931 film starring Bela Lugosi, right? 1931. It's the first the first sound film of the vampire figure. There were earlier ones in the pre-sound area. I think Nosferatu is a good example of that, right? He's not called Dracula, but he's a Dracula type figure. I'm sure he was probably influenced. The character was influenced by Bram Stoker, as well as the native Central European tradition of the vampire, right? But the 1931 is really the seminal film, and if you haven't seen it, heaven forbid, please go out and take a look at it. As a baby boomer, we watched that show. Oh, because we did. This is before the days of the internet, so we were locked into TV. We watched the reruns of Dracula over and over again. Todd Browning, 1931. And as a kid, you don't realize there's this whole political, cultural history behind it, as I'll be talking about today. 1931, Todd Browning, Bela Lugosi, Dracula. But now there's films called The Vampire, Embrace of the Vampire, Interview with the Vampire. I'll talk about Tom Cruise in a moment, because Anne Rice, the author, the novelist, I think, not just me, but I think is probably the good starting point of the huge popularity of vampirism and the vampire as a pop figure. It starts with Anne Rice, who I think she comes out of New Orleans, and she's one of the first people of these authors. In the old days, there was a sort of a sexist term applied to these people. Gore Vidal would call them authoresses, right? Female writers, right? Bah, I mean, they big mistake. They're powerful, and they wield a great deal of influence on the contemporary imagination. But Anne Rice was one of the few. I'll get back to her in a moment, because this is a movie version of her film. I think it's the Vampire Lestat, right? Starring our friend Tom Cruise, who keeps reappearing in all these seminal movies, right? Eyes Wide Shut. Why is it always Tom Cruise? That's something strange there. Some of you can go to other websites that are fascinated by that. I'm trying to dig a little bit deeper than that. And there was Buffy the Vampire Slayer. I think it started as a movie, then it became a series on Netflix. Embrace of the Vampire, you get the idea. Kiss of the Vampire, on and on and on. Scooby-Doo, even he has a vampire movie. Scooby-Doo, Music of the Vampire. Yeah. And the best title of all, and I haven't seen this, I admit it. Maybe I need to watch this out of duty, out of obligation, out of the thoroughness that any serious researcher, I'm being ironic here because I'm not going to look at it, most likely. But this is the most interesting title of all that I've seen of the recent or the current listings of vampire movies. 2009, the title is Lesbian Vampire Killers. Wow. Yes, okay. So let's go back to Professor Groom, Nick Groom's argument. He's saying that the vampire is a historically specific, you can pin down the dates, and I'll talk a little bit of the chronology in a moment here. You can pin down the date where the vampire as an imaginative construct, right? This creature, this undead person who sleeps during the day and comes out at night, like a bat, right? A vampire bat. And by the way, the first person to render in drawing a vampire bat on his travels as a naturalist, I don't know where he was at the time, Madagascar. I'm just guessing. He was, in some exotic location. But the first person to sketch it out and bring to the educated public, he was an Englishman. He brought it back there. Maybe it fueled the imagination of these Gothic writers, right? The first person to do that was Charles Darwin. Yes, Charles Darwin. So that's where the vampire, before that, people didn't know much about bats, let alone vampire bats. Anyway, just an interesting aside there. So Professor Groom's argument is that the vampire comes into being as a literary construction in a specific time and place. Let's just call it Victorian England for the sake of convenience, even though the vampire starts appearing a little bit earlier, before the reign of Queen Victoria, right? It's prefigured by this literary genre that's in formation, and it's called Gothic, with a capital G, Gothic. And I won't go into a labored explanation or definition of what Gothic literature is. That's not my purpose here. But let's just say that the vampire figure comes out of a long and illustrious tradition. It was already 100 years old by the time Bram Stoker wrote his book, Dracula, 1897. There were people at the late 18th century who weren't writing about vampires, but they were writing about similar dark themes, right? So it was kind of growing and evolving as Britain was coming to world power as an imperial, occupying, colonizing force in the world. I'm getting ahead of myself, right? So to validate or to substantiate his argument, his thesis, Professor Groom says that in the Bible, I think it comes from Groom, but in the Bible itself, which I have a 2-volume copy, I have it wasn't called the Old Testament, it was called, the books of Moses. We call it the Old Testament, or the first 5 books, right? The Torah, or the Pentateuch, if you prefer. So don't ding me for calling it Old Testament. And then the New Testament, which the people back then did not call New Testament either. The point is that I'm reading the commentary here as well. I'm reading all the footnotes and the endnotes and the interpretive notes, the philological, all just the generation of this. And he's right. I don't remember reading in either the first volume, I'll call the Old Testament for the sake of convenience, all right? Or I don't recall either reading anything about vampires in the Bible, right? But I do, it's just like know about the angels, the demons, the spirits, even the Nephilim are there, the giants, all these different creatures. Not to mention Satan, right? And all his different earthly manifestations, like the serpent. You know the story. So, but there's no vampires in the Bible. So that means that it's fairly modern. By modern, we can go back 200 years. The modern world didn't start when you were born. It started a couple 300 years ago, and that's with a different approach to the material world. Let's call it science, right? And the age of exploration. It's all kind of moving to this endpoint right now with the Davos Supra-State. At least they think it is. And they're using the vampire, I'm getting ahead of myself, but they're using the vampire psyops as part of the means to scare us into submission to their quote unquote protective custody. And it's been used before, as I will get into. They tried it, they meaning the globalists, the bankers, right, of the city of London and of Wall Street. They used it in different countries. They used it in the Philippines. They used it in Vietnam. They used the vampire, the bloodsucker, in order to scare people into submission. And they're doing the same. They're trying to do the same to us because, as we know, fear is a very, very simple but effective tool to subjugate large populations. Just look at what we're coming out of right now. In the early part of 2021, we've almost been under 12 months of incessant fear mongering from all the different suspects that we know and love. We're coming out of it, though. I feel it. I see it around me. I talk to people, and the signs are good. I don't think it's because of their awareness. Ironically, I think it's mostly out of apathy that people are, because the adrenaline begins to ebb out of your system, and you need a bigger high. So maybe there'll be another scare, a bigger scare. And we've talked earlier about the pending UFO scare, the giant hologram of Tupac Shakur in a spacesuit that's going to be something like that. They're incredibly imaginative. These underemployed PhDs are the ones that never finished their doctorate, who went to go to work for Pentagon and write all these little scenarios. And some of them are frustrated screenwriters who are on outskirts of Netflix Valley or Hollywood and dream up these really cheesy scenarios that are supposed to intimidate us, right? We, the beautiful human beings, who can and will survive anything that the evildoers want to throw at us, including vampirism. So it's not in the Bible. However, the blood-sucking non-human entities, they appear to be cross-cultural universals. You go to Java, or what was called Java back in the high days of British colonialism. You go to Japan, you go to Northern Africa, you go to Southern Africa. I mean, you get my point. The bloodsuckers are there because there's inequality in every society, every tribe. There's bloodsuckers, so it's very easy to translate that reality in human society to the animal world or to the nether kingdom of these non-human entities. But it seems to be, according to the anthropologists, a cross-cultural universe, and there's lots of literature. Don't take my word for it. And I'm not the master of it. I just happen to know that it's out there. I've looked at some of them. But let me give you some specific examples of this that I do have a little bit of information on, about using the vampires or the vampiric as a psyops. I'm a student of the Vietnam War. I taught Asian American studies. I had a lot of students their parents were refugees from Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. And I would lecture to them about the deep aspects of the Vietnam War, not there was the Gulf of Tonkin and Robert F. McNamara, then Kennedy was going to draw the troops out before, there's that stuff. I go into the deeper New World Order and the metaphysical aspects of the war, because that other stuff they can get from the standardized textbooks and the orthodox historians in the American Historical Association. Why do I have to repeat what they're telling? I have a unique take on this. Is why I'm saying don't try to understand this from the textbook standpoint, because I have something different and more substantive, I think, because I have what they have. I've mastered that, but I'm providing my particular insight. So I have some knowledge of the Vietnam War. I've taught it. I've only been there once. I stayed there for about a month, and it was one of the most fulfilling and eye-opening experiences of my life. I felt I had to go there because I'm a product of the Vietnam War era, and there were 2 million Vietnamese people, civilians, that were killed over the course of the American phase of the war. And before that, it was the French who were brutally oppressing their colonial subjects in Indochine, as they called it. But these people made revolution again, right? You can throw whatever you want. You can throw the French military might. You can throw American military might. But there's a peasant society, largely peasant back then. It's growing right now. It's no longer a peasant society. I hate to tell you that. I'm telling you now because we still have people running around thinking that people in Japan live in wooden shacks, right? and little Chinese people, right, are just living in slavery. Some of them are a very small percentage, because they've never been to these areas to check it out themselves, and realizing that it's really the United States is being turned into a third world country. We're being recolonized right now by the bankers, and these are people who look like the leadership, right? They're not Chinese. They're not Chi-Coms. They're not alien. They look, they're British people, in fact, or they're Canadian. They have a nice accent, and they're of the right racial type that are not a threat to the people. So all those people in indie media who are just mobilizing all these race baiting types of memes, go home, pack up. You're irrelevant, right? Make way. We're on to new and better insights. And by the way, I forgot to at the outset to congratulate our friend, our hero, our advocate, our pioneer in citizen journalism, one George Webb, for his debut yesterday at 9 o'clock Pacific time, 12 p.m., I guess, Eastern time. And he's doing a regularly scheduled show as of yesterday. And I was honored to be part of that inaugural program. And I'll try to remember to put a link in this presentation so you can go look at it and copy the video before it's taken down, download it, and save it. Because the censors, the algorithms don't know this, but this is a game-changing show that's debuting on so-called their platform, right? So that's what I mean by all the independent media people, the people who pachenicked us or who hope porned us and led us down the primrose path by bringing in psychological operations people like Jerome Corsi and Dr. Steve Pachenik and all these other characters. I think Joel Skousen is probably one of them, coming from the Latter-day Saints perspective. These are all, these are people that my parents warned me about, John Birchers, and these racial nationalists who think that there's a Chinese commie under every bed, right? Not that I'm, I hate oligarchs of all races and nationalities. So don't get me wrong. I'm not throwing my lot in with the Cha-Cons either. Oligarchies of any type are anathema to me and to you. And we're not going to let them get over on us. But we're not also going to let the hope porn people, the hopium dispensers, scare us into submission, right? And you know who they are. So distance yourself from them and start watching the Belt and Road Show, hosted by George Webb. That's the name, a beautiful name. And that's the present and that's the future of America, right? That's going to help revitalize our society, and it's the hope for the young people, the coming generations. They're going to be the Belt and Road generation. They're not going to be the Pokemon Go generation, if I have anything to say about it. And they're not going to be the vampiric victim generation either. They're going to be the Belt and Road generation, and they're going to benefit from the enormous wealth and exchange and trade and cooperation throughout all these diverse societies in this huge Earth island, as it's called, right? Instead of waging war on these people, like has been taking place since the origins of the British Empire, out of which the Gothic and the vampire emerges. See how I kind of brought it back to today's topic with that rant? But before I go on, I'll just tell you that this is a cross-cultural universal. In Mexico, in Latin America, they have their own vampiric tradition because, man, Mexico, if you want to talk about a beautiful country, a nation with two oceans, the Pacific and the Atlantic, huge, incredible resources, beautiful cultures, regional culture. I've been there. I just go there as often as I can, usually over the holidays during Christmas. I like to spend Christmas down there. They've been really bloodsucked by the usual suspects, right? You know who they are. They wear smelly robes, and they have the aura of legitimacy by putting a red cross on themselves, and you name it, or they claim to be above. They're deists, right? They're non-denominational, right? And they go around the world conquering society, just like I did the talk on Japan and how the Scottish Rite Freemasons went in there to try to bust up society. And before that, the Jesuits had tried to come in and bust up Japan. These are the same groups who've done this from society to society, including the United States right now in 2021. So these very groups have a literature, they have a culture that they're exporting. They write it for themselves for their own consumption, and they export it to us, and they have us internalize it. So I suspect that the Mexican vampiric tradition is a combination of the indigenous, that is from the Indian people there, as well as the Spanish colonial importation of it. And they have in the 20th century, apparently, according to this academic article by Edgar Martin del Campo, there is a figure called this is Noa. I can't remember how to pronounce it. It's a native language. Nahua, I think it's called. It's Teoloquani. I'm mispronouncing, I'm sure, but it's this vampiric tradition that I've alluded to. Check out our friend Jimmy Wales' enterprise, so-called Wikipedia, right? And you'll find this other character called the Tlahuapuchi, and I guess it's a Nahua term as well, a concept. So anyway, point taken. It's in our backyard as well. Now let me move in to our friend Queen Victoria, because I said that the Gothic and the vampire really comes to the fore under her reign, and her reign lasted 63 years. That's a long time. It didn't end until she died in 1901, right before the whole series of world wars that took place in her wake. And come to think of it, I think the fact that her reign lasted so long, and then it was followed by a 20th centuries of war, like almost continually. I think that's kind of like the fallout of the British imperial quest, with both World Wars I and II. Right. Anyway, that's an aside. So she was there a long time, and then you have the high point of British culture, brilliant. But you also have this sort of diseased, when I say disease, I mean dis-ease, uneasy relationship to the outside world and the people within the British Empire, right? The Welsh, the Irish, the Scots, right? All the different larger, and there are many other smaller groups, right, who are being pushed down during this imperial drive. They're being exploited, all the money, and they're being taxed, and their properties being. It's kind of like us, right here, middle class America, in order to extend and build the empire overseas. And the writers, the function of the writer and the artist, according to Claude Lévi-Strauss, the French anthropologist, the function of the writer, the artist, in any society, even the tribal society that he studied down in Brazil, right? He did his field work over there. And he came in a brilliant insight. He says all the arts, the mythology, the people who do totem poles or do music or film or new media, video games, they have one thing in common. They're trying to resolve contradictions in their social world. So if there's tensions, inequalities between men and women, they put it in fiction or they put it in a movie. If there's a certain ethnic group here that are vying for power and displace them, it manifests itself totemically in cultural expressions. Well, the same holds true for Gothic literature. All the tensions that this robust and thriving and dynamic Victorian society, because it's also the golden age of British science, right? There's a lot going for itself, right? And it's like everything else. There's two sides, a dark and a light side. But the literature that starts coming out as early as the late 18th century, it is embodying, it's expressing this dis-ease, this unease amongst the intelligentsia, the artists, who are seeing where this is going, what is being gained at the same time, what is being lost. And all your great artists, so that's why we keep reading them, are documenting this, and they're putting it forward in a highly entertaining narrative form. Some of the language is archaic, perhaps, and we have difficulty understanding. And this is why we have professors of English who used to explicate this material and provide historical and political contextualization to it before they got taken over by so-called big theorists, literary theory, where you don't even read books anymore. You're just talking about literariness. What makes the novel? Not talking about novels, but just talking about the sort of mechanics of it. And that's what's really crippled our understanding of the New World Order of the deep state. And I think it was purpose. They brought all these people from France and continental Europe, to a certain extent from Britain, and they put them into the advanced studies sites like Yale and Harvard and UC Irvine. Even brought some guys from Yale there to bring in literary studies so that we would not read the novels such as this that I happen to have right at hand, such as Anne Radcliffe, right, the Italian, because a lot of this has to do with the anxiety with classical culture, Greco-Roman, and Roman Catholicism, and the wars, the conflicts between Protestantism and Roman Catholicism in Britain. So you have people like Radcliffe who writes this book. By the way, this whole series, it's not a series, but there are any number of titles that could be called Gothic literature, and it's published by Oxford World's Classics, and I can recommend it. You won't go wrong if you see this uniform type style here, and it has great footnotes, great introductory essays, and I read them all because that's really what I'm interested in. I want to find out what Anne Radcliffe was telling us back then, and what do we have to learn from it today in 2021, so that we don't get taken over by Klaus Schwab, right, and the people that he represents, because he's just a cutout, right? And Oddker, I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name right, Machen, his family might have been of German origins originally, just like the royal family of Britain. This book, The Great God Pan, that's a novella, but this is a bunch of short stories mostly, and it's part of the Oxford World Classic. And you can come into some weird insights in reading this stuff. And I just realized, because I have some notes that I took here, I realized that this novella or long short story called The Great God Pan, it's a classic in this Gothic literature. So I went to it first. I think this short story is the premise of what later became Rosemary's Baby, which was a novel by Ira Levin, right? Who also wrote Boys from Brazil. And the premise is about how the Nazis were exfiltrated. This is before all this stuff came out in the history books. Ira Levin, I suspect, was OSS. One of you investigate who Ira Levin was. There's not a lot of material on him. And he was like Joseph Heller and J.D. Salinger, all these other people, and Kurt Vonnegut. They're all the same generation. They were telling us all this stuff and probably laughing at us as well. But I think this is the basis of Rosemary's Baby, because there's this great god Pan, which is half goat and half man. He's a chimerical figure. He's half beast and half human. He fathers a child with this woman named Mary. And Macon is an artist, so he's not going to grab our head and point and push it down into the book and say, yeah, I meant Virgin Mary. We have to figure that out for ourselves, right? And I said, oh, that's what he's talking about. It's the beast having sexual congress with Mary, creating the new Antichrist, right? The beast, as in we saw in the movie version of Rosemary's Baby, directed by none other than Roman Polanski, whose wife I put in the thumbnail for this talk here. She was in a film with him called The Vampire Killers, right? We'll get to that in a moment if I have the time. I might have to do a two-parter here, because this is really deep, and I got sidetracked, or not really sidetracked. I got pushed into a new area of vampire studies that I want to share with you. And it's very contemporary, and it's also very much in my geographic area where all this crazy type of activity is taking place here in Northern California, right? Hotel California. And then we got your Edgar Allan Poe, right? Obviously, there's Gothic touches there. Castle of Otranto, Horace Walpole, who later, or probably always already was a a cabinet minister, prime minister, maybe. I can't remember, but he's highly placed in government. Speaking of which, Benjamin Disraeli was a novelist as well, and he did become prime minister, a very important one, and key sort of post-Victorian, but modern imperial Britain. Right, these guys were men of letters. Okay, that's important to understand. They're politicians. They typically come from the upper middle class, the bourgeoisie, or even the nobility, and they have the wherewithal to write and to study, of course, at Oxford or Cambridge. And they're sifting through all this cultural information, and they're putting out the literature to talk to each other. And then we, the plebeians, the peasantry, gets these books. And by the time we read them in high school or junior high school, we say, "Man, this language is so old. We want to watch Star Wars movies." But it's a message, and it's all undergoing a revival right now amongst young people, because they, ironically enough, have been turned on by this whole tradition by reading Harry Potter and the Hunger Games, and reading interviews by these authors. I read, Anne Radcliffe, and so they want to check it out. And they're going back to the origins. A lot of younger people, and they're finding, wow, this stuff's really good. Just like people who first found out about the Illuminati and all the other people and symbols and signs and the occult, Washington, D.C., they found out through Dan Brown, right? And they had, wow, that's really amazing. And then they started digging. They said, oh my gosh, Dan Brown's plagiarizing from all these works of scholarship. And this stuff's all real, but he's popularizing. Well, it's the same function at play, or the same after effects for the kids who grew up with Harry Potter, or Lord of the Rings, and both of them, Tolkien and C.S. Lewis were academics, right, from Cambridge, and or they were lecturers or professors there, and they were not rewriting, but reintroducing the mythos of the British Isles to the British subjects. So I'm not going to go to, because I'm running out of time already. I'm not going to go through the chronology, but there are books on this. This comes out of the University of Wales Press. It's an academic book. It's called Gothic Literature, 1825 to 1914. It's the history of the Gothic. As I told you before, in academia, Gothic studies has become popular. I never thought I would see the day where they're reading this stuff, because I thought it was going to be Jacques Derrida and Paul de Man and all these wankers, who are getting endowed chairs in comparative literature in Yale, place, that they don't talk about fiction, ironically, but they're professors of comparative literature. So anyway, I'm not going to go through this right now, because I've hit some of the high points, but just to let you know, these books here, people like our own Bram Stoker. I'm giving him a German pronunciation. I think it was Bram Stoker or Bram Stoker. He was preceded by people like Charles Dickens, right? We all had to read that in junior high or high school, and we watched all the movies, right? And we're familiar with sort of these characters, these stock characters. But so he's out of this milieu. It comes later. This book, by the way, this is recommended. It's not public. It's not in print anymore, so I got it used, fortunately, and it was a great buy. And it's called The Annotated Dracula. That is, you have the full 1897 reproduction of the original novel by Bram Stoker, who has a great, interesting biography, which I'll get to in a moment. But it's annotated, just like these Oxford World Literature series. There's footnotes. So some of the arcane, anachronistic terminology that we don't know, it helped. And then when they define it here in the margins, you understand, you could appreciate his artistry and name checking certain places, people, and things in his fiction. And in addition to amplifying, there's not a lot of critical. It's mostly just footnoting some of his reference here, and it's lavishly illustrated with photographs as well as graphics from the time, from the period, the late Victorian period in which he was writing. So check this one out. Also, I would recommend, since we're running out of time here, this incredible book. This is an author I just discovered for myself. And again, like I told you at the outset, you don't ever hit the bottom on any of this stuff. So be a little bit humble and modest about what you know about Star Wars or video games or everything else, because you don't. I don't. And it's arrogant to think so, because I get comments from people who oh, well, you didn't do this. Yeah, I probably missed it. And I don't have any notes here that I'm reading off of. I don't have the luxury of going into Wikipedia like you do to research this stuff. So anyway, his name's David J. Schall, and he's described in the flyleaf here as a leading American cultural historian and critic of horror films and Gothic literature. He's the author of The Monster Show and Hollywood Gothic, which I guess is about cinema. And so I'm going to get the rest of his books here and read them. And and I haven't read this book. It's over 600 pages long, and it looks really good. He was probably in a PhD. I'm guessing he was interested in Gothic literature at a time when Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault and all these imported people from continental Europe and maybe Britain, were reigning in the English departments and the so-called departments of comparative literature. But he was interested in the Gothic. He wanted to read books, so he probably dropped out of a PhD program. But he had the chops, he had the skills to research and write books. I'm just guessing. What I need to do is contact David J. Schall and interview him and put him on the show here. And by the way, I'm as I mentioned yesterday on George's debut show, the goal here is to deplatform YouTube as quickly as possible. So enjoy it while you can, YouTube. But I'm going to get rid of you by and by. I'm going to deplatform you. You do not deserve me. I'm of such high quality that you do not deserve what I have to offer YouTube and you bloodsuckers out there. And I'm going to deplatform you. And I'm going to have a call-in radio show that's going to be web-based, so I can interview people like this. And I'm also going to be talking to you. You're going to call in, and we're going to talk, and you can tell me about your fascination with Anne Rice. Okay, because I want to know. I haven't read a single Anne Rice novel, and I know she's hugely popular, and I know someone out there reads her and knows a lot about it, and I want to learn from you. Same with the VC Andrews freaks. I've only read 2.5 really, and she only wrote 7. Right, the rest of them were taken over by this guy, and that's part of the psyops. I think once these people get so big, like J.K. Rowling, they push them aside and then they start writing books for them once they've established their brand. But I don't think I'll be able to have time to get into it today. But I wanted to break it down how the publishing industry works. But in the time of Bram Stoker and people like that, it wasn't that way. These guys wrote their own material. They weren't ghosting for anybody or fronting for anybody. But read the book. It gets into the occult history the milieu out of which he comes. It talks about other world famous literary types that we all know and love. People like Oscar Wilde. They were kind of they had an uneasy relationship because they were both vying for the spotlight. But they knew each other, and they were both Irish, and they both are graduates from Trinity College. They had a lot of biographical crossing points here. But the point is that both of them made incredible Gothic statements, right? Portrait of Dorian Gray, does that not have Gothic influences? Yeah, I think so. That's been made into a movies versions innumerable times, and in addition to be reprinted over and over again. It's a classic, for justifiably so. So let me I already talked about the vampire hunt. That's Schall has written a book on that, and most of you have seen this, so I'm going to skip over that in the interest of time. But so let me conclude then with my thesis. All this attention, this focus, all the huge resources and enormous creative energies put into the manufacture of vampire type movies and miniseries and TV shows and books, fiction, you name it. There's a whole subculture, you might even argue, built upon the vampire. But I would argue, and again, this is not a blanket because you've heard this story before when I've talked about other popular culture artifacts like Lego, right? As a psyops, and maybe these are all part of a larger effort here. But definitely today in 2021, or in the years preceding our current time here in February 2nd, 2021, right? The vampire, I think, starting with in the U.S. and English language, the vampire started becoming a psyoperation with Anne Rice back in I think in the 70s or something. Oh, by the way, I should start go back a little bit, talk about the psyops, right? Because I talked about Vietnam. This was workshopped overseas in Vietnam in a psyops called Operation Wandering Soul. And what these technicians, by the way, it was overseen by a person that you've probably read about. Those of you who are watching this have a very strong background, a lot of preparation that you brought to this particular show here. So you know who Colonel Edward Lansdale is or was, right? It was his brainchild, Colonel Edward Lansdale, who, by the way, professionally was an advertising man. He was out of San Francisco. He's an advertising dude. I mention that because psyops, manipulation, behavioral modification, and entrainment, and the advertising, you know this from Edward Bernays, right, is very much consistent with what he was doing overseas, first in the Philippines, and then he transferred his skill over to Vietnam. And in Operation Wandering Soul specifically, what he did to terrorize the countryside, the peasantry, who were the supporters of what we called the Viet Cong. They didn't call themselves that. They called themselves friends, the liberators from French and Japanese and American imperialism. So he came up with this program called Operation Wandering Soul, and they would be recording all these unearthly voices and sounds. And I reread this, and I knew about it first, and it reminded me of a current project I'm doing, which I'll share with you presently. I don't know when, but as soon as I look at this material. But it reminded me of Nine Inch Nails, what they were doing, years later. I think Trenton Reznor is a product of Operation Wandering Soul. He might not even know about it, right? It's a sonic warfare against the audience. People are already having mental problems and instability. Well, this was workshopped on the Vietnamese peasantry and Wandering Soul. But one specific exercise of a Wandering Soul, Operation Wandering Soul, masterminded by Colonel Edward Lansdale, was to take villagers, kill them, drain them of blood, so they're all, sheet white, and have a little device that would create 2 puncture wounds right here, like a vampire, and then put that corpse in a trail where the peasants would walk by. And they go, oh my God, this is part of our vampiric tradition, right? We're scared, we're frightened. But it was all, Edward Lansdale's people, Chuck laughing up their sleeve at the ignorant peasants. But the peasants were not ignorant. They knew that. They knew that the big con was on the American people and the military establishment that were funding all this stuff. Of course, they were making money on it, but it was having zero effect on the intended victim. But that wasn't the intention, as it turned out. The intention was for these people to make tons of money for their private contractual services, and then take absconding with it, just like what's going on today in 2021 with the BlackBerries, with the compromising of elections, and trafficking in drugs, humans, and all kinds of financial crimes. It's going on in 2021. That's very much connected to what's going on in Vietnam. So this is the psyops, that these so-called civilian contractors, which are mercenaries, and a lot of them were unemployed PhDs, behavioral scientists who couldn't get jobs or decide, some of them were true believers. They thought they were helping save America from the communist menace, the Chi-Coms, right? The domino theory, if Vietnam falls, then the Chi-Coms will be on our door before you know it. So that's so I skipped that part. So that's part of the psyops we're seeing today in 2021. Now, before I conclude, I just wanted to, and I'll carry this over to next Thursday. I've just decided right now, here and now. This carries over to a book that I read over the weekend. And rarely do I sit down and read a book from cover to cover. Usually I skip around and I put it down and jump to something else. But this book was riveting. And it's very much it's on this continuum of vampirism and psyops that is the focus, the theme of today's talk. And this book is called Lost and Found, written by John Glatt, Glatt, and the subtitle is The True Story of J.C. Lee Dugard and the Abduction That Shocked the World. And this took place in my part of the world. This is not the Budapest, Hungary of the Dracula novel. That's where it starts, right? Of Bram Stoker. This is not London of Jack the Ripper period of time. This is in my own backyard, right here. And very briefly, because I only have 4 minutes here, in 1991, 11-year-old J.C. Lee Dugard was kidnapped on her morning walk to the school bus. The search for J.C. made national headlines and was the case. Yeah, it's some TV show I wanted to mention. And this happened not far from here off of Highway 50 in South Lake Tahoe. That's where she and her parents were living back. And she was snatched as she was at the bus stop. And her fellow students saw this vehicle come in with a woman who was dark skinned, olive complected. They said they thought she was an Arab woman. She's actually Latina. And a husband who turned out to be Philip Garrido. And her name was Nancy Garrido, her maiden name, Boca Negra, which is black head. You know, that's how I remembered it. And she was 11 years old at the time, and she was missing for, get this, 18 years. She was missing, and she was held captive in a little rude structure in the backyard of Phil Garrido's house. His elderly mother owned the house, but he constructed this facility back there, and he fathered 2 children with J.C. Lee Dugard. And they went undetected for all those years. And they were finally busted. And this guy was on parole because he was already a convicted sex criminal, but he slipped through. And this is where this author does not go where I think the story leads. I think that law enforcement, the parole agencies, and maybe even the larger investigative agencies were complicit in the intentional oversight of the parole of one Philip Garrido for 18 years, right? Because he was caught, guess where? At the University of California, Berkeley. An alert campus cop saw his 2 children that he had fathered in this shed in the backyard. They're very well behaved. They were wearing thrift store clothes. They called him Dad, and he was there. He was schizoid, I guess, Phil Garrido, trying to get a permit to show off his little schizophrenia box. We talked about Kaczynski the other day, right? This is very much along the lines of your Charles. I'm not saying Charles Murray was involved, but it's sort of it was reminiscent of the Charles A. Murray type of psychological programming experiments on human beings. In this case, it was Theodore John Kaczynski. And this is not covered by John Glatt. That's what I'm bringing to it. I think Phil Garrido himself was subjected to, he went through some sort of mind control program. And I won't go into specifics on how I'm inferring this. I'll save that for next Thursday. But the point I wanted to leave you with here is that the vampiric psyops has been workshopped through situations like this. This is proof of concept. It doesn't end here. This is proof of concept for what the fear merchants want to roll out to American society in general, right? They're putting this out here because is what I've found, because, you know, I claim some certain degree of expertise about serial killers and mass murders. I've written about, I published it in academic journals, right? Not that that makes me better than you or makes me into the definitive expert, but I'm saying I'm pretty serious about this literature. It's just not something I just came across and then just spouting off about off the cuff here. It's consistent with years and years of study that I've done. But during that time, I came to realize, I didn't know this at the beginning, that a lot of these seemingly random crimes, right, serial killers and all that, are really operations from intelligence agencies. They're experiment, and they're like wide. They're supposed to have a widespread application once they have the proof of concept here. And that's why we're in such a bad situation, ladies and gentlemen, in 2021. So the first step is to kind of break down this mechanism, and you have to go back to the Victorian period where all the social science and all the science and all the poison gases and the technologies of enslavement and of transport and the financial shenanigans. This is the infrastructure that was being laid out for us generations ago, ladies and gentlemen. So once equipped with that knowledge, that information, once we have a fairly good understanding of it, then we can now start planning our escape from the little dungeons that these people have constructed for us. We're free. We're sovereign human beings. We cannot be chained down. We cannot be incarcerated. We're going to bust out of that rusty cage, right? Whose song was that, huh? Yeah, you know who I'm talking about. He committed suicide, Rusty Cage. Maybe I'll talk about his music career. A lot of these guys have a lot in common. People doing sonic warfare on the American people, right? The world population. Ladies and gentlemen, that's my time. I thank you for your attention. Chat amongst yourselves. If you're a Patreon, I'll see you tomorrow at 12 noon. If you're not, join Patreon and join the seminar and I got some really good stuff for tomorrow, talking about this vampire who was a psychologist, but he's not a medical doctor. He's a vampire. He invented a dehumanizing, humiliating, and medically untenable and unsound means of aborting fetuses. All right. And this lead was provided to me by one of the people who are supporting me on Patreon. I thank you. I'm not going to name you, but I hope you're in the meeting. You can lead the discussion tomorrow in our seminar tomorrow at noon Pacific Standard Time. So I'm just giving you a preview of what we're doing outside of YouTube here and where we're going. All right. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. We'll see you on Thursday. Bye. Have a good day. Bye.